This is the second session today, and since I, along with others, only have sometimes a small, brief opportunity, I would want to say thank you to Tim, to Gillian, to Karen, to all the staff members for their outstanding hospitality and it's really, as was said earlier by Mark, like an extended family. It feels such a warm, inclusive academic environment and enduring friendship, so that's fantastic. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce a distinguished panel on momentum, how terrorist campaigns evolve and escalate or decline. For me, this is a subject dear to my heart, especially as I spend time here in this quadrangle, thinking about the interlocking dynamics of Hezbollah's political, social, and military components, where terrorism was embedded in an interlocking relationship with Iran's security architecture. A wise civil servant in the UK once told me to understand terrorism in the Middle East is like playing three-dimensional chess underwater with all the pieces moving along these three dimensions. And we're very pleased to have three chess masters to be able to unlock and see where these campaigns begin and end in a range of different, in different groups, in different contexts. First off, we will have Professor Audrey Cronin, who probably doesn't need any introduction, but I will say that she's the founding director of the Center for Security Innovation and New Technology at the American University in Washington, D.C., and a professor at the School of International Service. Long and distinguished academic and policy career. I remember when her book on How Terrorism Ends came out, Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorism Campaigns. I thought to myself, how smart to think about, because all of us are chasing the violence and the continuation, etc., but really not reflecting, how do they end? How do they decline? Or how do they escalate? I also want to make a plug for her latest book. She may do that herself, but I'll do it anyway. Power to the People, how open technological innovation is arming tomorrow's terrorists, looking at the emerging technologies and how that impact on various groups. We also have Dr. Sarah Marston, who is a senior lecturer in radicalization and protest in a digital age in the Department of Politics, Philosophy, Religion at Lancaster University. Also representing, first of all, she's been here at St. Andrews, but also she represents another great research collaboration scheme, CREST, which is really contributing. She also has a book coming out, I think forthcoming, called Violent Legacies, Why Militant Movements Endure. And last but not least, we have a distinguished discussant, my friend Dr. Diego Muro, who is a senior lecturer here. He's also held positions at King's and the European Institute in Oxford. He also has published widely on this issue. And more recently, When Does Terrorism Work? We have the whole spectrum, the whole gamut of perspectives. So I think it would be very rich, a rich discussion. We'll do the same format, 30 minutes presentation, followed by the discussant, who would provide about 10 minutes, if it's all right. And then we'll open up to the floor for open Q&A. So please help me welcome Audrey Cronin.
Well, I'm always accustomed to needing to adjust the microphone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Gillian. I have an apology to make right from the outset, which is, it's always a bad thing to start with an apology. I should probably end with an apology. But in any case, I'm not going to actually be talking directly on the question of how terrorism ends. I'm going to be talking more about the new book, but I am very happy to discuss how terrorism ends and how it relates to current events and current challenges during the question and answers. So I thank you very much, and instead I'm going to be talking about issues related to the new book. To give you some background to how Terrorism Ends came out in 2009, and about 5 years ago I began to feel like I was missing something in the bigger picture. And a brilliant terrorism scholar wrote a book called Terrorism in Context. I think we know who she is. She's been a wonderful mentor to me, wonderful friend. So Martha's book has always reminded me that we need to think about the political and historical context that we're living in, and that sometimes things evolve, and if we get too deeply into the specifics, into tiny questions, we can miss the bigger picture. So I'm not sure whether or not I've accomplished the image of the bigger picture, but that's what I'm going to be talking about today, to try to put things in context, because I'm concerned about some big changes that are underway and the degree to which I, as a terrorism expert, am looking too narrowly and missing the broad seismic changes that are happening in our world. So let me begin by talking about today's technological context. Everybody talks about the fact that we're in the middle of a digital technological revolution. And they speak of the information age, the robotics age, or the fourth industrial revolution. And it all seems new and different from anything we've ever experienced in the past. But is that really true? And if we're in a revolution, what exactly does that mean, and how does it relate to the study of terrorism? Because it's certainly not separate from the rest of the world. So that's the central question of the new book that I've published called Power to the People. And what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes is how super empowered individuals use new technologies to harm people. Because if we get to the essence of what terrorism is, and we stop fighting over the definition and the boundaries and so on, if we get to the essence of what it is, you're talking about the ability of individuals or small groups to have agency to carry out some kind of violence, political violence. And I think we have a tendency, we had a tendency through the 20th century, for reasons that were very legitimate at that time, to believe that the means of the violence are static and are unchanging. And I actually think they were for much of the 20th century. So that was the right argument. But I think we're in a new context now. So what I'm going to try to do is not to be either an alarmist or a techno-utopian, and just to confront this problem head on and to suggest a few solutions. We can use the lessons of history and strategy to anticipate what is likely to happen, and then challenge our brilliant digital technologies to their best purposes, including counterterrorism. And I'll cover 3 big questions in the next approximately 30 minutes. And they're very big, so I'm not going to be able to get into a lot of detail, and I hope you'll forgive me that when we can talk more, either informally or at the Q&A. The first big question is, what is the nature of technological innovation today? Because I think that relates to how individuals and small groups are going to innovate. So what's the big nature today? Secondly, how does lethal technology spread, particularly with political violence? And then thirdly, what technology-driven changes can we anticipate in political violence now and in the future? So let's begin with the nature of technological innovation today. And I'm going to lay out a contrast that I think exists between open and closed technological revolutions. A closed technological revolution was what we had during the 20th century. With the concentrating of state power and the dawning of the nuclear age. The most dynamic elements of technological innovation were happening with state control or some kind of control, be it copyrights or secret laboratories or very small groups. During a closed technological revolution, military or scientific elites limit the availability of new technologies like nuclear weapons, battleships, jet fighters, or radar, or even more modest technologies. And these things are expensive, rare, difficult to build. The technologies require high levels of expertise. They're carefully protected by things like security clearances and copyrights. And so we speak of proliferation of these types of weapons. And we use phrases like dual use, meaning that they have two types of users, civilians and military. That's the phraseology of the 20th century. And that's the model of military technology that dominated throughout most of that century. So if you think of the iconic image, it would be an Albert Einstein or a J. Robert Oppenheimer, or maybe even Minsky at the MIT Media Lab developing early applications of the internet. But anyway, they're working away in a secret lab with a very small team of scientists developing, in the case of Oppenheimer, developing the nuclear bomb. That's the iconic image of the 20th century. Then the United States and some of the Western powers opened the Pandora's box. The United States, in particular, at the end of the 20th century, consciously shifted from closed technological development to open development. And it was prompted by Cold War euphoria about a US-dominated so-called New World Order. Virtually all the major developments that we are experiencing today were driven by publicly financed basic and applied research that first happened in the United States in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then they were shared during the 1990s. So there's a long list, but just a few examples. ARPANET became the internet. Tax dollars developed the GPS system. Google built their search engine with funding from a National Science Foundation grant. Virtually all the major components of smartphones came from US government programs, including microchips, touchscreens, even voice-activated assistants like Siri, Alexa. None of this is to take away from the brilliant innovations that were occurring in Silicon Valley, or even in Bill Gates' parents' garage, or Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room at Harvard. But the US government consciously shared these basic technologies, and as a result, what we have now, almost 30 years later, is the maturing of an open technological revolution. And it's having global effects, including on political violence. In an open technological revolution, there's popular access to lethal technologies. You don't have to be a nuclear scientist or a brilliant engineer to use them. You don't even have to fully understand them, because these platforms are designed specifically to help people like you and me to experiment. For example, people who use a smartphone to drive a simple robot don't know how to actually build a smartphone, and nor do they need to. Individuals and private groups are free to buy, use, and distribute these technologies, and also to invent new purposes for them, new forms of them, new surprise combinations of them. And they spread via commercial patterns that are uncontrolled and unpredictable. They can be accessed, bought, sold, and combined and changed, which means they can surprise us. So in this type of revolution, there's a much broader range of people who have access to the technologies, and the people who are involved would be four different kinds of people: professionals, professional consumers, or what Toffler called prosumers, hobbyists, and regular consumers. So it's way beyond just military and civilian. It's way beyond just those two categories. That broader range of people changes the equation of who can buy new tools, who can use them, where, why, how, and it has an impact on violence, well beyond what's happening on a conventional battlefield. So mind you, we still have to focus on technologies that our elites are building, like artificial intelligence and the arms race in AI between the US and China. There's a lot of attention on that in Washington, where I live. That's the high end of technological change, and it is important. But we also need to consider low-end, revolutionary technologies that are causing broader societal change. These are affecting patterns of conflict, especially in terrorism, insurgency, mass shooting incidents, and other types of individual or small violence. And looking through the history of warfare, all kinds of warfare, key watersheds have resulted not just from which side has the most technologically advanced or powerful means, but from a major shift in who can use new weapons, who can show up to fight. So, going back to history, Richard, the last time we had this kind of open technological revolution was at the end of the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was maturing. And just like today, there were changes in global patterns of technological innovation, trade, communications. And just like today, there was giddy optimism about technology's potential to change the world. And there was no clear dividing line between amateur and professional scientific communities. So today, members of the public are free to buy drones and robots or build primitive gene splicing kits. They can download instructions for 3D printing firearms. Well, during the 19th century, they could freely get things like cheap wiring kits, chemicals, high explosives, along with instructions from new journals that were established at the time, like Scientific American and Popular Science. They were specifically dedicated to helping the amateur tinker with the technologies that were maturing at the end of the Industrial Revolution. A remarkable range of innovations emerged from the work of independent inventors, tinkerers, hobbyists, prosumers, and many of them affected what happened in the First and Second World War. So one key point to remember is there's no hermeneutic kind of division between terrorism, political violence, insurgency on the one hand, and war. You've got more traditional kinds of war that bleed over, civil war. Anyway, so the First and Second World War used many of the products that were developed at the end of the 19th century. Gottlieb Daimler invented the motorcycle in 1885, and he was tinkering in a little glass and brick summer cottage in the backyard just outside Stuttgart. Italian electrician Guglielmo Marconi invented the radio in the attic of his home. Orville and Wilbur Wright, you know that story. 1903, and they were brilliant bicycle manufacturers, but they were working in their own little workshop. And very familiar to all of us as terrorism experts, Alfred Nobel first tinkered with explosives in a shed in the backyard of his family home. And he ultimately came up with dynamite, which built the Brooklyn Bridge and the Panama Canal and many other great pieces of infrastructure, some of them right near us, but also launched the first wave of modern terrorism. So, in short, today's technologies are emerging in an open technological revolution, and they have more in common with accessible open lethal technologies like dynamite or IEDs than they do with 20th century military technologies like nuclear weapons, aircraft carriers, tanks, or some of the other military weapons that people are focused upon. So that brings us to the second big question. How does lethal technology spread in political violence and in other types of violence? Well, we already know quite a lot about how these technologies spread in political violence. So let's dig a little deeper into the story of dynamite. Dynamite set off that first wave of modern terrorism. The anarchist wave is what Rappaport calls it, but it actually includes a lot of other groups, nationalist groups, social revolutionaries. It killed or injured thousands of civilians, and it contributed to a surge of assassinations from the Russian Tsar Alexander II in 1881 to the French president, the Spanish prime minister, the Italian king, US President McKinley in 1903. There's a long list. These folks were killed not just with dynamite, some were killed using guns, but that kind of wave of assassination of leaders began by targeting those who were in charge, and then it actually evolved into targeting what we would today call soft targets, so civilians. And then those killings, culminated with the outbreak of the First World War. Newly laid underwater telegraph cables spread news of what were called dynamitings throughout the world. Stories with graphic details of dynamite bloodshed lured readers and sold newspapers, especially in the United States. It was an era of what was even then referred to as fake news. But they also inspired similar violence elsewhere. And a crucial element in the global diffusion of dynamitings was the appearance of the mass market newspapers and their sensationalized headlines. Coverage of dynamite attacks affected and attracted new readers in droves, and papers cut their prices in order to optimize sales. In the United States, for example, between 1883 and 1895, the circulation of Pulitzer's New York World grew from 15,000 to 600,000. And even though the paper only cost 5 cents an issue, it was by far the most profitable newspaper ever published. And Hearst's New York Journal was not far behind. So there were 3 key factors at the time. Number 1 was accessible, new lethal technology. Second is a new communications vector. And third is the global diffusion of individual and small group political violence. In my book, we developed a database. I can talk to you more about that. It has thousands of dynamite attacks, and we studied how exactly they spread and why dynamite spread and other technologies did not spread. Between 1867 and 1934, worldwide dynamitings killed people on every continent except Antarctica. So other explosives that didn't spread, ballistite, gun cotton, these were things that should have been more attractive, and so we tried to understand why they were not. And we found consistent patterns that can help us sort through some of what is happening today. So the second key historical case in what we studied was the Kalashnikov. The second wave of modern political violence was the anti-colonial wave, according to Rappaport. But anyway, it was importantly propelled, or at least assisted, by a newly available technology, the AK-47 assault rifle. Pressures for decolonization had complex roots, and those included the dashing of colonial people's hopes of national self-determination after World War I. But after 1945, insurgencies surged, and they were fueled, at least in part, by the Automat Kalashnikov model 1947, or the AK-47. The genius of the gun was its simplicity. It was designed for illiterate, malnourished peasants conscripted into the Red Army. It was easy to carry, shorter than the infantry rifles that it replaced. It weighed only 10 pounds, and its parts were interchangeable gun to gun. It also rattled, was inaccurate, shorter range than most competitors, and it was the butt of ridicule by firearms experts in the UK and in the United States especially. But the AK-47 changed the world. Often, of course, terrorists had used firearms before the AK-47, but those were expensive, difficult to maintain, and much more effective in the hands of well-trained professional soldiers. So the relationship between the usage was more uneven. Professional soldiers were much better at using firearms. The AK-47 changed the global equation. It became the most widely dispersed firearm in history. It outstripped the next family of rifles, the American M16, by 5 or 10 times. Tens of millions were manufactured, created, promoted, distributed by the Soviet government, which did not believe in patents at the time, until the 70s, and basically bartered the weapon for political influence with allies, or oftentimes for hard currency. As a little girl, I lived in the American embassy in Moscow, and I can remember very well that we would bring our dollars with us, and if we were allowed to, which we were not, you could go out to the black market, and for $1 you could get 7, 8, 9 rubles, whereas we were paying $1.67 for each ruble individually. So, the ruble didn't float, for those of you that are perhaps not remembering that era. It didn't have a direct exchange. So in order to get hard currency, this had to be brought in or through bartering, especially early between about the 1945 and about 1975. Basically, because the Soviet Union was bartering all these AK-47s, that made it the exception within the 20th century, I would argue. So it became like an open technological platform. Kalashnikov factories proliferated around the globe as others manufactured it, copied it, distributed it, created new forms of it, and again, treated it as an open technological platform that was free and open for them to use. Like dynamite, The rifle developed symbolic resonance that helped it spread through global communications, including magazines and television. And the rate of success in insurgencies depends on which scholar you're following, but they went from something in the range of 25% in the aftermath of the Second World War, 25% success between 1775 and 1945, to more than 40% from 1945 to the present. Today, the Kalashnikov is cheap, accessible, simple to use, an open technology that continues to diffuse throughout the world with outsized effects. And today there are 70 to 100 million of them worldwide. So the point is that open lethal technologies have patterns of diffusion that we can trace. So we also have the tracing of the spread of factories and the development of violence with respect to the AK-47, the global insurgencies. We can understand and anticipate both which technologies spread and also which ones don't spread. So this leads to what I've called in the book a lethal empowerment theory. I've left that to the middle because it's a little boring to talk about it in stark theoretical terms, but lethal empowerment theory holds that disruptive lethal technologies that spread are accessible, cheap, simple to use, transportable, concealable, effective, meaning leverage, more bang for the buck for the individual, multi-use, not cutting edge, meaning they're in the second or third wave of innovation, which I would argue is where we are now with the digital revolution, bought off the shelf or easily purchased somehow, part of a cluster of other emerging technologies that can integrate, symbolically resonant, and given to unexpected uses. So open technological innovation of potentially lethal technology through commercial processes changes political violence, just as it does every other element of our lives. Why would it be any different? And we can anticipate which technologies are most likely to diffuse going into the future. So that brings me to the last question. I can't see the clock, so I hope I'm on time. Okay. What technology-driven changes can we anticipate now and in the future? Well, open innovation and diffusion of new technologies is driving changes in global political violence already across three broad functions. The most familiar is the first one, how people mobilize for violence. But secondly, how they project power, or what the military would call reach. And finally, how they integrate complex systems. I'll explain each of those. By the way, in the 20th century, it required an army to do those three things. Individual groups could mobilize, or individual groups might have the capacity to do any one of them, but you didn't have the capacity to have all three. That has changed. Now individuals or small groups, including terrorists, have the ability to do all three. So let's begin with open innovation of mobilization. That's the one that gets all the press. It's usually, some people call it radicalization through social media, but it goes beyond that. It's not new to use new means of communication to recruit or train people. In the 19th century, the anarchists published pamphlets with detailed instruction booklets on how to acquire and use dynamite. What's new today is that everyone has a powerful computer in their pockets, and it can reach almost anyone, anywhere. It's consciously designed to be addictive, and it's the perfect tool for social, physical, and psychological mobilization. What's also new today is mass interactivity. Robotic replication of messages by automated fake accounts, live streaming of attacks, high-quality first-person filmmaking that makes anyone a television producer. Now, much of this is wonderful. We get automatic alerts when there are weather events and widespread warnings of national disasters. Amateur filming of human rights abuses prevents repressive regimes from hiding their behavior. Much of this is wonderful. I am only talking about the risk side. We could talk a lot, and there are many great books written about the opportunities of our new technology. Let me stipulate that. But on the risk side, it's yielding some horrible outcomes. For example, Brenton Tarrant's March 2019 killing of 51 people worshiping in Christchurch, was immediately streamed. It's not just the availability of messages driving political violence. There's also increased potential for individual perpetrators to be individually targeted and groomed. That's new too. The scope, the scale. So much of our private information is online that groups can tailor their recruitment messages to the individual person. They can pick out people through online activity. And they also have the means to carry out attacks at greater distance, which leads to the second big trend, which is open innovation of reach or power projection. This has been developing for a while. Okay. In September of 2014, working with the MITRE Corporation in McLean, there were a bunch of students that created a Razor drone. It had an Android phone as its brain. It was unbelievably creative in what they accomplished. And this has happened all throughout the world, and that's 5 years ago. A military-grade drone that was capable of carrying a 1.5-pound payload. It's a good example, though, of how ordinary people are combining clusters of technologies, and they're creating something new. UAVs, robots, 3D printing, nascent autonomy, they all offer greater reach to individuals. And new technologies are pinging off each other. So I think the period today is more like the Renaissance than it is the Manhattan Project. And another key aspect of reach is facial recognition capability. Much more sophisticated now, much more available. We all have it in our phones, Android, Galaxy Note, and so on and so forth. Law enforcement is using FRT commonly. Police in China use glasses that are embedded and enabled with facial recognition. Of course, in Xinjiang province, it's ubiquitous. FRT is also, though, available to individuals. And that kind of tool easily identifies targets for killing. We can go over individual examples during the Q&A. Just like in the 19th century, the targeting of individuals will evolve. As leaders become more protected, civilians will be targeted instead. Another often mentioned example, probably overdone, is suicide attacks using driverless cars. Again, I have very little time. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But it is the case that we need to pay attention to the ability to hack sensors and the whole structural, in many cases, grid system that enables us to have driverless cars. And then there's additive manufacturing or 3D printing that enables the production of parts closer to where they're needed and can be transforming, but it's also enabling the printing of primitive firearms, many of which are more dangerous to the user actually than the victim, but they can be better developed with more expensive 3D printers, and also they can be used in intimidation. And the gunman in Halle, Germany, who tried to get into the synagogue on October 9th, he used 3D printed firearms. I think Bruce is going to talk more about that. Meanwhile, we're increasingly vulnerable targets. All of our electronic appliances and computerized devices are connected to the Internet of Things. Things like kitchen appliances, thermostats. You can't even buy an appliance anymore without its connectivity. That's an unprecedented degree of reach into individual people's lives. So finally, systems integration. The malicious use of artificial intelligence. Our systems are becoming so complex, fast, data-rich, and advanced that human intelligence can't integrate them and manage them. And so the answer is to build in degrees of autonomy. Artificial intelligence is an enormous range, it's an enormous topic. I won't be able to go into detail. I'm not trying to hype the dangers of artificial intelligence because we're using forms of machine learning very commonly now. Machine learning is not general artificial intelligence, and that is too much hyped and too much alarmism around that. But simple forms of autonomy and artificial intelligence will become cheaper, more accessible, more potentially lethal in future decades, especially in this second and third wave of innovation. And the result will be two potentially competing outcomes, one positive and the other dystopian. So is this the use of artificial intelligence about more careful and discriminate targeting beyond what faulty humans can do? Or is it about developing killing machines? The answer depends on who controls the data and where the data comes from and how they train the AI. Anyway, so to wrap up, I don't think that there's much representation of the public interest when it comes to the evolution of our digital technologies. And as experts on terrorism At least I believe that what we should be doing is representing the interests of the people. We already know what technological changes are most likely to lead to destabilizing political violence. We can foresee which technologies have classic characteristics that will make them diffuse through commercial processes in an open technological revolution. I've barely touched on that topic. You know, we're all selling our own books, I guess. But anyhow, it's more described, and a lot of the details are in the thing. I won't even say what it is. You know, I'm trying to be slightly humble, but it shouldn't come as a surprise, is what I'm saying, that we've seen this before in the history of political violence, and we have to develop countermeasures now, as well as a mix. You know, it's going to be a complicated set of different types of regulations, global agreements, voluntary restraints. You have to have governments and private corporations involved more effectively. If we're going to avoid the very predictable unfolding of political violence that is happening now and will accelerate, I believe, into the future, the means of violence are something that we have paid too little attention to, particularly going forward. If we fail to consider the risks of this open technological revolution and fail to consider the negative side of our brilliant technologies, we won't be able to build a positive future.
Power to the People, now available. Book launch next Wednesday, American University. We now go on to Sarah. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's lovely to be back. I did my PhD here and then had the good fortune to work for a couple of years as a lecturer as well, so I do feel like I'm coming home a little bit, so I'm really appreciative of the invitation. Not least because some of the ideas I'm going to talk about now began to emerge and take shape whilst I was here. And one of the questions that preoccupied me was that across the world, violent non-state actors orchestrate campaigns that kill thousands, and in some cases can last decades. But yet, as Audrey's book showed us, the chances of them achieving their political ambitions remain small. So what does that tell us then about the utility of terrorism? And what explains its persistence in the face of political failure? So to try and explore those questions, I'd like to propose 3 shifts in emphasis that perhaps move us on in respect of the literature that's engaged with this question so far. First, that it's valuable to look beyond measures of political success and failure which have dominated the literature to date, and to instead examine a wider set of outcomes and think about organisational, political and cultural consequences of violence and consider how they interact and unfold over time. And second, perhaps rather than seeking out large-scale theoretical explanations for terrorism's persistence, it's useful to examine those mid-level mechanisms and processes that change relations between actors across cycles of contention. And finally, instead of assuming that states and their non-state opponents are locked in an inherently antagonistic relationship, I think that there are explanatory gains to be made by looking at how opponents' interests interact and occasionally coincide in ways which can create permissive environments in which militancy can endure. So, to explore the potential of this approach, I'm going to set out very briefly a comparative account of the political, organisational and cultural dynamics associated with 2 militant movements, global jihadism in Yemen and the far right in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, by most measures, many of the specific groups which make up those 2 movements would be considered failures. But looking across 3 generations of militancy reveals that their claim-making has brought about important organisational, cultural and political shifts, and that each generation has changed the opportunities available for future generations of claim-makers. And those shifts have emerged through the dynamic interaction between state and non-state actors' interests. And at times, those interests have coincided to create a permissive environment within which militancy has sustained itself. Created through the intermittent and incomplete patterns of repression and occasional co-optation by powerful state actors, these environments have allowed the diffusion of tactics, collective identities, and networks from one generation to another. And in these two cases at least, these relational processes have seen terrorism persist despite its short-term political failure. Now, of course, we all know terrorism's effectiveness has been assessed using a whole variety of measures, from process and outcome goals through to strategic, tactical, and personal rewards, right down to specific strategies like attrition, intimidation, provocation, and outbidding. And those contrasting measures do lead to somewhat different conclusions about terrorism's success rate. But those studies which look at terrorism's efficacy at achieving wider-scale political goals, as Max showed us yesterday, is largely ineffective. Perhaps 7 to 13% of groups achieve their political ambitions. Now, alongside debates about terrorism's effectiveness, works also looked at the longevity of militant groups. And despite the oft-cited claim that 90% of terrorist groups last less than a year, more recent works found that, on average, around 50% last longer than 12 months, and perhaps half of those are still active after 10 years. Now, there's a great deal of variation behind those figures, but it's striking to note that significant numbers of groups persist despite the apparently low chances of them achieving their political aims. So, of course, there are a range of different reasons why terrorism might persist despite its apparently weak strategic potential. Groups might not know that using terrorism is liable to be ineffective, or might perceive that it's likely to be more effective than available alternatives. Given the difficulties maintaining clandestine groups, organisational and security concerns can come to take precedence over strategy. And alternatively, they can be guided by less instrumental objectives like revenge and solidarity. Adjudicating between these reasons for terrorism's persistence in the face of failure is, of course, challenging. Militant groups aren't unitary. Leaders and followers and different factions can have contrasting motivations, and they can shape decision-making. The interaction between different outcome measures and the range of causal factors that are involved can make it really difficult to develop a holistic understanding of why terrorism continues to be used. There's, of course, significant variation within militant groups. Some are small cells. Others are large organisations with sophisticated command and control structures. More fundamentally, the assumption that militant groups abide by a strategic logic rooted in rational choice models has been challenged. And finally, of course, the perennial problem of gaining access to militant group decision-making means that analysis is really hampered by incomplete information about what happens within those organisations. So those issues mean that making generalisations about militant groups is really challenging. Now, one alternative is to take a historically informed, case study-based approach to look at specific groups and their trajectories. And they offer incredibly rich, valuable detail. And they highlight the evolution of political campaigns. But they're perhaps less able to generate broader comparative insights. What they do demonstrate, however, are the benefits of looking beyond short-term assessments of success and failure, illustrating the value of longitudinal assessments of terrorism's outcomes. So that although individual groups might disintegrate or be disrupted, it really isn't uncommon for militant organisations to be part of much wider movements, which persist over long periods of time. And it seems to me that understanding the impact of violence across cycles of contention promises really important insights into terrorism's effects, which can help us explain its persistence. So to move forward, I found it helpful to look beyond terrorism studies, to wander into a different part of the library, and to think about the potential of methods and theories developed in political sociology, and in particular the body of work on contentious politics and social movements. And this is well placed to address the fact that terrorism's not, as Charles Tilley argued, a causally coherent phenomenon. Recognising that terrorism is a type of violence used by different groups for reasons which change and which can differ within and between militant groups draws attention to the importance of looking at lower order processes. And that approach seems better able to interpret terrorism's impact and its persistence by deploying more nuanced outcome measures. It recognises the need to assess group characteristics and behaviours in relation to the political context in which they operate. And importantly, it takes account of the role of the state in shaping opportunities for violence. And finally, work on social movements and contentious politics considers that dynamic nature of wider cycles of contention and the complex ways in which these evolve. Also, the body of work on social movement outcomes has long recognised the limitations of net effect assessments of collective action, and instead sought to look in more detail at political, organisational, biographical and cultural outcomes. To explain how these still relatively broad outcome measures play out, it's helpful to draw more specifically on the relational approach developed in contentious politics. And that focuses on identifying those mechanisms and processes which drive contention by examining how collective action changes relations between actors. So those mechanisms and processes have been defined as a delimited class of events that alter relations among a specified set of elements in identical or similar ways across a variety of situations. So, for example, brokerage, which creates links between previously unconnected sites, or identity boundary formation, which generates new us-them distinctions. So by focusing on how violence changes relations between actors, this approach seems to answer the call to bring the state back in and better contextualise assessments of terrorism's outcomes. Recognising the crucial role that those interactions play in the dynamics of violence reveals how sometimes militant and state actors' goals might not always be entirely antagonistic. As David Keynes argued in relation to armed conflict, winning is only one part of war, and sometimes a surprisingly small part. Militant actors are influenced by a wide range of motivations, and they can sometimes align with their opponent's interests in ways which can prolong conflict. So Keynes' approach helps to explain why some wars continue. And in a similar vein, I'd like to argue that breaking down that dichotomy between state and non-state actors' goals and understanding how they can interact can sometimes help us better understand and explain why terrorism might continue to be used despite its apparently short-term political failure. So to pursue this idea, and to go into the weeds a little bit, I want to look at two violent movements, global jihadists in Yemen and the radical right in Israel-Palestine. Now, of course, those two movements have distinct organisational and political features. Yemen's global jihadists have got greater potential for violence, but relatively limited political capacity. The radical right in Israel-Palestine have more political reach, but lower potential for violence. The political contexts in which they operate are also different. Yemen's characterised by low levels of democracy, civil rights, and intermittent political stability. Whilst Israel, although it's a composite regime made up of two peoples inhabiting one land, has, according to most measures, and certainly in comparison to Yemen, higher levels of political freedom and stability. What both countries have in common are sporadic periods of conflict, which have informed how state actors have responded to the two movements' claim-making. So in selecting those two cases, the aim is to see whether similar mechanisms and processes drive change in divergent periods, places, and regimes. Jihadists in Yemen and the radical right in Israel-Palestine are now complex constellations of actors with different factions and political ambitions. But they didn't begin that way. At the end of the Afghan-Soviet war, the global jihadist agenda had relatively few adherents in Yemen, whilst in the lee of the Six-Day War in Israel, although there were, of course, a number of actors on the right, that current had yet to encompass the most virulent, racist and right-wing views that came to be embodied by Rabbi Meir Kahane and his group Kach. And that's the aspect of the far right that I'm focusing on. Since then, global jihadists in Yemen and the radical right in Israel-Palestine have been involved in cycles of contention that have played out across 3 generations of actors. Reviewing the histories of those two movements is complex, and I won't do justice to them this morning. They've repeatedly reconstituted themselves, and there are multiple local, national, and international actors that have played a hand in their evolution. So to try and provide a bit of structure to trace the genealogy of those movements, I'm going to draw attention to a number of mechanisms which are important in understanding their contention. The ones I focus on here are repression, which raises the costs of claim making, decertification, or the withdrawal of support by the state, co-optation, which sees previously excluded groups brought into a centre of power, and finally diffusion, which involves the spread of groups of contentious performances or ideas from one site, or in our case, generation, to another. Now, there are a range of other mechanisms and processes implicated in their claim making, which I really can't do justice to. And these are the ones, nevertheless, that seem to be most useful in interpreting relations with the state and the development of permissive environments which have played a role in enabling violence to persist over time. So, looking first at the radical right in Israel-Palestine. From small beginnings in New York, Kahana established the Jewish Defense League before emigrating to Israel and setting up Kach in the early 1970s. Kach was a racist far-right group which called for what they described as the transfer of Palestinians from Israel and consolidation of control over Greater Israel. It incorporated both formal political campaigning through its political party and violent street politics enacted by Kahana's followers. Kahana himself was more of a political entrepreneur than he was a violent specialist, and this first generation of claim-making saw some electoral success. Kahana won election to the Knesset in 1984 and began putting forward provocative and racist bills almost immediately. But that, however, was short-lived. Others on the right, who feared he'd take their votes, actually put forward a bill banning racist parties, which saw Kach prohibited from running in subsequent elections. So although he experienced this relatively swift process of decertification from mainstream politics, he did nevertheless make some gains. He made political space for himself by activating a further identity boundary in the right wing and promoting a far more overtly racist discourse that would be put to use by far-right actors long after his demise. Kahana was assassinated in 1990 in New York by a man with links to militant Islamists. A little before that, as the first Intifada developed momentum, Kahana's followers established the Committee for the Security of the Highways to supposedly protect Jews travelling on the roads in the West Bank. And that was an agenda which almost immediately evolved into attacking Palestinians. But, despite having carried out hundreds of operations involving incitement, trespass, beatings, shootings and arson, almost none were sanctioned. The relatively limited repression they experienced and the failure to enforce the rule of law in the West Bank provided a space for the Kahanists to pursue their violent claim-making and promote their conceptualization of a new, strong Jewish identity. Kahana's death saw a second generation of actors come to the fore to lead Kach and establish Kahana Chai, or Kahana Lives. Most, including his son, had been followers before his death, and they continued promoting his political and violent agenda until, in 1994, Baruch Goldstein, an acolyte of Kahana's, shot dead 29 Muslims in the Al-Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. And the effect of that attack on the network of Kahanists in the West Bank was significant. The government banned them. It made supporting and preaching their ideology a crime. And that process of repression curtailed their activities for a period, but it didn't stop them entirely. Those from Kach and to a lesser extent Kahana Chai continued to engage in low-level contention, providing training in military tactics and religious studies and instruction in Kahanist ideology. And they were also involved in some pretty significant plots to emerge from that milieu. They also largely avoided conviction. And alongside that, key protagonists continued to engage in electoral politics, repeatedly seeking election right up until this year. The most recent group of far-right actors who have demonstrated some sympathy to Kahana's ideas are associated with a new generation of settlers known as the Hilltop Youth. They've been involved in multiple price tag attacks, an epithet used to describe attacks against property and land and assaults against Palestinians. And there are important links between those generations of actors. They're visible in the tactics they use, which bear a striking resemblance to some of the Kahanists' earliest vigilante violence, and the ideological hybridization which has seen Kahana's ideas brought together with extreme aspects of messianic redemptionism and the self-sufficiency of Jewish labour pioneers. The networks of people are also overlapping. To take just one example, Kahana's grandson, Meir Ettinger, is heavily involved in the Hilltop Youth, including through a group called The Revolt, which was implicated in the firebombing of a Palestinian house that killed 3 people, including an 18-month-old baby. So together, that seems to suggest that the repertoire of contention that first coalesced under Kahana continues to resonate with the current generation of the radical right, and that there continues to be a space in which the most violent aspects of their claim-making can be enacted. Central to those dynamics is the mechanism of diffusion, or the spread of contentious performances from one site and one generation to another. And that process is informed by cultural linkages which reflect a shared sense of identity or common social category. And those linkages are clearly reflected in the lineage of the radical right. In a similar way to previous generations, this process is enabled by the permissive environment within the West Bank that's enabled Kahanism to evolve and become incorporated and developed so that a new generation incorporated into its claim-making, and in so doing, make it become a lived reality for some of those in the West Bank. Now, of course, the scale of contention and violence in Yemen is extremely different. But there is a similar pattern of intermittent repression, desertification, and more direct co-optation by the state that's seen violence persist over the last 4 decades. Jihadism in Yemen evolved from a small base. Following splits between the Afghan Arabs who'd fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan, Zayn al-Mihdar set up the Aden Abiyan Islamic Army. And that was the first really recognisably jihadist group in the country. And that happened in the early 1990s. They called for the downfall of both the far enemy, but also of President Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime in Yemen. Al-Mihdar and the army went on to carry out a series of attacks and kidnappings. Now, as well as failing to reach an agreement with bin Laden, who's also trying to gather some momentum for his agenda in Yemen, Al-Mihdar repeatedly refused to accept a mediated agreement with the government to end the violence. And that decision ultimately led to his and his group's relatively swift demise. The experience of the Aden Abiyan Islamic Army reflected Saleh's favoured counter-terrorism tools, co-optation into his system of patronage or violent repression. Co-optation was common in Yemen. The political culture developed in a way that accommodating political rivals and reaching mediated agreements was a trusted form of conflict resolution. The price for not agreeing to that, for Al-Mihdar, was execution and the end of Yemen's first generation of jihadists. The second generation, in the form of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, took a different approach to relations with the Yemeni government. And they came to light following the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. Now, the details, as they often are, remain relatively murky, but it does seem likely that there were relations between members of Yemen's internal security organisation and Al-Qaeda which at least smoothed the path for some of what they were up to. And that kind of informal co-optation might not have played a direct role in enabling the attack, but the limited cooperation afforded by the Yemeni government to the US investigation of the Cole bombing created a more favourable context within which Al-Qaeda in Yemen could, for a time, operate. However, the political opportunity structure facing the jihadists would change significantly with the events of September 11th, when Saleh saw the financial and political advantages of cooperating with America in its war on terror. By the end of 2002, Al-Qaeda's operations in Yemen were in disarray, its leaders and many of its members dead or in custody. The jihadist movement had experienced the full repressive force of the Yemeni security apparatus and for a period was in abeyance. The third generation of jihadist militancy would begin with the jailbreak of 23 Al-Qaeda loyalists, some of whom had been swept up in that earlier post-9/11 period. And they went on to form an alliance with Saudi exiles to become Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, AQAP constituted itself around the time of 2 internal uprisings. In the north, the Houthi rebellion was growing momentum, whilst in the south, the peace movement of the south was beginning to call for secession. And those conflicts created risks and opportunities both for President Saleh and for Al-Qaeda. Saleh took the opportunity to conflate the threat from Al-Qaeda, the southern secessionists and the Houthi rebellion in the north, and tried to leverage the threat from the jihadists as an excuse to crack down on the security threats he was facing at home and gain international support. For AQAP, the instability gave them the opportunity to hold and govern territory, something they'd go on to do repeatedly over the years. And the increasingly complex mosaic of local, regional, and international conflicts has meant that AQAP have at times benefited from a more favourable environment than might have been expected. While Saleh was still in power, many believed he'd allowed the jihadists to take over territory by withdrawing the army, to bolster his argument that really it was only him that could control the chaos which would prevail if he were deposed. More recently, there's some evidence that even in the midst of the repression that AQAP have been experiencing through the US drone campaign, they may have reached an agreement with the Saudi-led coalition on a one case-by-case basis because they share a common enemy in the Houthis. And that's created opportunities for al-Qaeda to blow both sides against the middle. So in this most recent period of contention, it seems that the same mechanisms of co-optation and repression informed by shifting strategic alliances are at work, and they continue to inform patterns of contention in the country. Now, depending on how you interpret these groups' outcomes, they can either be seen as persistent failures or as a successful militant movement. The discrete groups that constitute these movements have disintegrated, they've lost leaders, they've been crushed by the state repression, and they've become involved in bitter intra-movement competition. So they might have won some tactical victories, but political success is a long way off. Taking a longer view suggests that the global jihadists in Yemen and the Kahanists in Israel-Palestine have been more successful than perhaps that short-term assessment might suggest. Both movements have consolidated their ideological agendas, polarizing and extending the ideological and discursive context within which their claim-making is pursued. They've maintained a violent presence that's influenced the socio-political landscape for decades, and in that way, they've changed the opportunities for political participation and violent mobilization over the medium to long term. In assessing these movements' evolution, it's clear that each group of militants has been influenced in important ways by the previous generation's claim-making. And it's also the case that their trajectories have been crucially impacted by state responses and the sometimes unanticipated consequences of state, non-state actor interactions. The state's response in both cases has been informed by the activities it prohibited and those it was perhaps more tolerant of. In Yemen, attacks against the state invited violent repression, whereas militancy directed beyond its borders, between non-state actors, or in ways that served powerful state actors' interests were, at times, tolerated. With the breakdown of the state in Yemen, AQAP has been able to find more opportunities to pursue its agenda. And although, of course, they and the previous generations of jihadists have experienced significant repression, there have been periods where they've had far greater latitude to mobilise, either because state actors haven't moved against them, perhaps as in the early days of al-Qaeda in Yemen, or in the absence of state security and basic services, they've been able to broker local relationships that have supported their claim-making. In Israel, the violence from the far right's not always attracted significant state sanction. The UN's described the comparatively lenient attitude towards this as a long-standing concern and one that's contributed to persistently high levels of settler violence, including price tag attacks. So whilst the processes of repression and decertification have certainly had a negative effect, they've not been sufficiently robust to destroy them. And that pattern has repeated itself across all three generations of claim-making. Unless there's a potentially destabilising attack, such as that perpetrated by Baruch Goldstein, they're afforded a space where their ideals can become a lived reality, and violence can be deployed often at low personal risk. So in both contexts, in the periods between more assertive state action, what might be described as a permissive environments allowed the movements to reconstitute and remobilise when the political opportunity structure changes. And it's in those periods that through the mechanism of diffusion, ideas, practices and identities spread from one site or generation to another. So it's possible to see the same mechanisms of inconsistent repression, occasional co-optation, operating in really very different settings to produce a similar kind of outcome. Intermittent but persistent violence, including terrorism, emerging from once marginal non-state actors in the context of increasingly complex, protracted social conflicts. So, to conclude, looked at individually, most of the groups that make up those movements have failed. Kach, Kahana High, the Committee for the Security of the Roads, the Aden Abiyan Islamic Army, and perhaps even Al-Qaeda in Yemen have all ended without achieving their political goals. However, looking across the generations of claim makers implicated in those cycles of contention reveals a different picture. Taking that longer view illustrates how, in these two cases at least, militant actors have taken advantage of permissive environments which have seen the movement persist despite the failure of those specific groups. Such environments are characterized by intermittent patterns of repression, decertification and cooptation, and emerge at the intersection of state and non-state actors' interests. Tracing those dynamics by looking at how specific mechanisms play out makes it possible to develop comparative insights, which reveal how two quite different movements have been shaped by similar relational processes. And it reveals how a range of political, organizational, and cultural outcomes have interacted and unfolded over time. Culturally, those permissive environments have enabled the diffusion of ideas, symbols, collective identities, and violent practices, and those support future generations of claim makers. Organizationally, they provide space for movements to regroup and remobilize, whilst politically they make it possible for new alliances to be brokered and political agendas to be framed and pursued. Now, that's not to be deterministic. Of course, the state has an important role. But looking across the cycles of contention in which the radical right and the jihadists have been involved makes it possible to see how each generation creates the context for future contention through the production of ideological, organizational, and political resources. And that changes the opportunities available for future generations of claim makers. So in interpreting terrorism's outcomes, I've sought to make 3 points. First, suggesting that efforts to understand why terrorism persists in the face of political failure and to explain its impact benefit from a more flexible and comprehensive approach to outcomes than perhaps the political or strategic measures we've used so far allow. Second, taking a relational approach to interpreting how particular outcomes emerge makes it possible to go beyond individual cases, but whilst avoiding those higher-level interpretations which are perhaps less able to satisfactorily explain the complex processes implicated in violent political contention. And finally, I've argued that it's important to recognise the role of the state in creating and shaping the opportunities for violence over the long term. Doing so makes it possible to see how permissive environments can be exploited by militant movements and create the context for different kinds of cultural, organisational and political outcomes to unfold across cycles of contention. So to better understand those dynamics and to understand why terrorism persists despite what might appear to be its short-term political failure, it's important to recognise that state and militant movements' interests can at times interact in ways which can create the context for terrorism to persist. And in doing so, reminds us that we should take the long view on how terrorism plays out. Thank you.
Thank you for managing such complexity with great clarity. So, Diego, the challenge is now for you to bridge these two.
Right. Well, it's true that it's not an easy job, the one I have. Originally, this was supposed to be a session on the end of terrorist groups, how it all ends, I think it was. Now decline has been moved to a parenthesis, and it's how terrorist campaigns evolve and escalate. But it doesn't matter. I have enjoyed both your papers and both your presentations. It's true that they do not speak to each other. It's difficult to come up with common themes. I guess a positive reading of all this is that since you're no longer interested in studying the decline of groups, that means that we're not going to run out of a job, of things to study. So I think we may have another 25 years for the center, which is good. Tim, you can stay in the job for another 25 years. And of course, one of the papers by Sarah was on the reproduction of terrorism, what allows for the continuation of political violence. Audrey's was on technological innovation, and I will have to separate my comments, and I'll have a set of questions for each one of you. I'll start with Audrey. I think that the paper or the chapter that I read, perhaps introduction, is interesting because it engages with the present and with the future. And I think that's very daring and it's admirable. You talk about technological innovation and creative destruction. And I had a couple of questions that I was going to play. I was going to play classical music today. I had my sonata. But in a way, you have already answered those, so I'll have to play jazz. So I'll have to improvise. So coming from your presentation, what I thought I could say was that when you talk about open and close technological revolutions, right? But it could be argued that a closed technological revolution is not a technological revolution, right? Economies, well, Schumpeter talk about the creative destruction of capitalism, the ability to create a technology that then disrupts social, political, and economic forms. Economists talk about Kondratyov waves, right? So you have a new technology, and that creates a wave of, again, technological growth, which again disrupts traditional forms. So a closed technological innovation would not be analogous to the discovery of the steam engine, the combustion engine, electricity, and so on and so forth. If we move these to sort of communication technology, such as the telegraph or the telephone and so on, your type of revolution would not be a new one either, because it would be rooted in the 1950s and 1960s with the discovery of superconductors, the microchip, the digital age, and so on and so forth. So perhaps my comment would be, is this a technological revolution, and is it new at all? Or is it a continuation from the technological discoveries of the 1960s? The other point I wanted to make was that from your presentation, and of course there's the big book, right? So I mean, all this may be answered there. It's not entirely clear whether technology is a facilitator or is a cause in itself, right? I didn't know whether this was an independent variable or a facilitator. You talk about the AK-47. So does it make it possible, or does it create the revolutionary movement? So perhaps some clarification there, which I'm sure is in the book, would be welcome. I have a few other points for Sarah. I enjoyed your paper very much. The paper is about why terrorism persists. It's full of ideas, and I have trouble sort of choosing which ones I want to emphasize. I think the idea of permissive environments and the fact that there is a dynamic interaction between the state and non-state actors is crucial to understanding terrorism. We often study groups and campaigns in isolation, so I think that is crucial. You cite someone who talks about bringing the state back in. I cannot agree more. But I guess the question is, to what extent does your work invalidate previous work on the success and failure of terrorism, right? And you will have to come up with some sort of understanding definition of what is success and failure for you. And I understand that we may have coded these very narrowly, and there may be short-term goals and long-term goals, or organizational goals and individual goals, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, even if you bring this complex interaction and the case study research and so on and so forth, you have to come up with an operationalization of these two terms, right? So I wasn't entirely clear what these were and how are you going to solve these issues in I guess, your book as well. The second point, again, has to do with this dialectical relationship between these two actors, the non-state agent and the state. And this has to do with the fact that perhaps we have spent far too much time analyzing whether terrorism or political violence is effective, delivers the political goals that it aims to deliver, and we are completely neglecting the other side of the coin, which is counterterrorism, right? So should we be studying a little bit more what is the effectiveness of counterterrorist campaigns, and should we, again, think about how to code success and failure? Should we put some more work into seeing whether we can evaluate current CVE and PVE programs national strategies, local strategies, and so on and so forth. Because once again, what you have told us is that these two agents are interlocked, right? So we're interested in the success and failure of terrorist groups. We will have to do the same thing for the other side. And we're not doing that, or we haven't talked about this so far in the conference. I know there are people who are working on this. And I think that's clearly missing from the presentation, at least. I think it is mentioned in the paper. And I think with that, I'll end my improvisation. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thank you. I think we have a little bit of time. I'm going to let you respond to the questions.
Okay. First of all, my heartfelt apology, because it was a kind of a, Tim and I were discussing this before the conference a few months ago. It was a dilemma for me as to whether to come here and talk about how terrorism ends, which is kind of what I'm known for. Well, okay, but I have been rather mean to you, Diego. I'm sorry, because the new book has just come out, and those arguments weren't really accessible until literally 3 or 4 days ago. So this is all very fresh and new, and I'm impressed that you were able to come up with things to discuss on the basis of my not giving you much warning at all. So thank you very much, and my apologies. I owe you a drink at the pub, or probably 5. But anyway, to answer your questions, it is true that I've not given you a fully fleshed out explanation of the differences between open and closed innovation. But let me just say that, of course, I do develop them more in the book, but technological innovation always builds on things that have happened earlier. So the technological innovation that was happening at the end of the 19th century that led to the invention and sort of lighting off of modern terrorism was using things that were building upon platforms, far more important platforms of technology that had occurred earlier in the 19th century. So, you know, it's absolutely true that many of the societal changes that were happening had already happened several decades before, the railroad and all the other examples that you mentioned, including the, you know, the refining of steel. You could not have had Alfred Nobel working with nitroglycerin had that not been invented earlier by Sobrero. I mean, the development, the degree to which chemistry had already come quite a long way was pretty mature by that point. So my point is not that this was a unique era, completely separate from all the technological precursors to it, more that this was an era of innovation that was open to public participation. So that's what makes it open. It's open because you're able to be able to build upon the shoulders of others who have built far more fundamental, basic research. And that's where I think we are today with our technologies. Actually, a lot of what we're using right now and what we're doing right now is really ho-hum. I mean, it's building upon key breakthroughs that happened in much more private settings and much more controlled settings back in the 20th century. But the reason I bring it up is that now we have open access, and I think it's changing already our societies in much broader ways, and it's changing how political violence is unfolding. So is it a causal or a facilitator? You know, this is a key issue always for political scientists. I've written a different article, which is coming out in a few months, looking at regression analysis and trying, particularly with respect to the dynamite example, to look at the causal factor. And I really haven't gone over all of that data. I think we can prove that it was a causal factor to the development and spread of political violence, but that is work that is still underway, and it's coming out within the next 6 months, I would say. The book talks about more correlation than causation. It does not prove causation, although it lays out all the data. And there's a website that we've just put all the data onto that will be launched within the next month, I'd say. So right now, mostly correlation, but I'm holding out the likelihood and almost certainty, I'd like to argue, that it's causation. So I think those were the key questions, right? Yeah, Sarah.
Thanks, Diego. So I feel in good company with Max Abrams and following the panel yesterday, thinking about outcomes. In terms of how to operationalize outcomes, I really don't want to walk away from the complexity of these processes, and I don't want to give a sort of an easy answer as to how they might be operationalized. So really what I would like to do is to keep broadening out how we think about success and failure. It doesn't invalidate or contradict anything that's gone before. It hopefully extends it and enriches it so that we can think more generally and more broadly and perhaps in more sophisticated terms about what terrorism's effects actually are and how they're felt and wrought, and to accept that complexity and to instead consider the specific mechanisms of success and failure. So to give a slightly more kind of concrete answer, to nest them under cultural, organisational and political outcomes, but then think carefully about how we operationalise those mechanisms. So the way that I approach that is by drawing on American pragmatist thought, which assumes that we're all problem solvers, that we face problems and we mobilise habitual or creative responses in engaging and dealing with those problems. So I think what we need to do is actually start with the problems that militant groups recognise and are facing, and from there develop an understanding of how they seek to resolve them and then what relational effects emerge from that process. And then not to sort of shy away from it and kind of look for a parsimonious code book, but instead actually map out how all those mechanisms relate to one another across cultural, organisational and political goals. So that's not a very, this is more of a sociological than a political science answer, but I don't think we should walk away from the complexity. In terms of that greater focus on counterterrorism and its effectiveness, yes, of course, really very little work's been done on that, and it does need far more attention. But I wouldn't want that body of work, if it were to emerge now, to repeat some of the challenges that's faced efforts to look at terrorism's effects. And actually what I'd rather do is look at those interactions. So to instead of sort of saying, okay, so specifically what are the counterterrorism's effects, but actually look at how those relational processes operate. So to think in a slightly more sophisticated way about how we understand state and non-state actor interactions, and to really kind of commit to that relational approach. And I think actually just to perhaps say I could see some parallels between our papers.
Well done.
Well, particularly because what you're still talking about are particular mechanisms, relational processes, which I recognise from starting from a very different point. You talked about diffusion of tactics of innovation. You talked about brokerage, so that you began with that notion of connection and mobilisation processes that contemporary technologies enable. That's supporting brokerage, the connection between different sites. Integrating complex systems represents, a broader process of scale shift, so that broader constellations of actors can come together in ways which enable actually deinstitutionalization, if you're thinking about that as a mechanism, away from those kind of closed systems towards open ones. So I can actually see, we're still dealing with people, and so those relational processes still play out in communities, in the different actors that you described described spaces. So I still think that we can think about those processes in similar sorts of ways.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Thank you. And we now have about 25 minutes for questions. I see.